In this demonstration, we are going to go through the process of creating and managing automation rules in Microsoft Sentinel. To get started, you will need to be in the Azure portal. And from the Azure portal, you can go into the Sentinel environment where you can start creating your automation rules. So here we are in a Sentinel environment. And what we have here is a couple of analytic rules. Some analytic rules are active, some analytic rules are just a template and yet need to be activated. Now, as we have seen before, is that these analytic rules, they are responsible for analyzing data that we get via the data connectors. And then when there in that data stream certain anomalies are detected, the analytic rule will be responsible for creating incidents and alerts. Depending on the environment, depending on how data is used, you might see more or less incidents and alerts in this incident view. Now, the automation rules that we are going to work with, they are here to automate responses based on either alerts or the incidents that are created by those analytic rules based on the data that we get via the data connectors. If you want to work with analytic rules, there is different ways for you to start building them. For example, you can create an automation rule just like this by just go in and create the automation rule. Now from here, we can start entering the name of the automation rule. So for example, we could name this my first automation rule. And then we can set up a trigger. It's super important to realize that a trigger is initiating the automation rule to start running. As you can see here, we have 3 reasons for an automation rule to be triggered. Either when an incident is created, or when an incident is updated, so if we make changes to an incident, or when an alert is being created. Now, for example, we could choose to go and say, hey, I want to create an automation rule that is going to run when an incident is created. Now, the next step is that we need to go and set, okay, but what would be that incident provider? So one of the defaults here says that if any incident is created with any analytic rule is being part of that, then we will trigger the incident, or then we will trigger the automation rule. So if I leave the defaults, then the automation rule will respond to any incident created in the Sentinel workspace. Now, obviously, it makes sense to go and create different conditions because it makes sense to not have an equal response to any kind of incident. So one of the things we could do is when we go and say, hey, what if the incident provider is something else? Based on the amount of connectors, you might be able to see some differences. So for example, I could go and say, hey, but I want the incident provider to be Microsoft 365 Defender. And maybe we want to add a condition, for example, an AND statement, where we could go and say, hey, maybe in the tag has a certain value in it. Or we can go and say where the status has a value in it, for example, when an incident is new. Now, every time an incident is created, the incident is new anyways. So in that example, that doesn't really help us out. Also, we can see some more interesting things, like what if it's a certain MITRE ATT&CK tactics being used? Or, for example, when the severity of the incident equals to, for example, high. This allows us to go in and say, okay, so if any of my Microsoft 365 Defender products creates an incident with the severity of high, then I want my automation rule to run. The next step is that we can start adding actions in there. So here we can go and, for example, do something with the incident or alert. And that is actually where automation rules are built upon. So for example, if, for example, we can see that somewhere in Microsoft 365 Defender, we see a high severity incident coming in, we might want to go and change the owner for that incident. And we might want to assign someone in the organization to become the owner of that incident. So maybe in the organization we have a group, or we have a certain set of people that are responsible for the triage that we can do against Microsoft 365 Defender. And in that case, this is what you want to do. Maybe you also want to add some extra actions. And what you'll see here is that the lines of text created by the automation rule, they follow a certain order. So if you would be looking into an automation rule, you could actually think of this as an if this, then that solution. Because the condition here would be the if this, and the actions are the then that solution. But what you'll see is you can add multiple actions. So in fact, it will become an if this, then that, and then another thing is the thing that is the automation rule logic. So for example, after assigning an owner, we may also want to add a tag to the incident. And we can go and say, this is, for example, the Microsoft 365 tag. So we know that if we search for incidents related to Microsoft 365, we can search on those tags. And maybe we also want to add another action. And one of the nicer things in preview at the moment in Microsoft Sentinel is that we can ask tasks. We can add tasks. For example, we can set up a task that says that we want to inform the CISO, the Chief Information and Security Officer, about the incident. That could be the task that you want to add in here, and we can just go in and add a description of the task. So here we can add a description. Just like that, we can sort of go in and start creating extra tasks, and we can do all kinds of things to set up everything nicely in the environment. We can even link to other documents, or we can add pictures in there. We can change some we can change a little bit of the layout here for that description of the task. And just like that, we can start adding all kinds of steps into that automation rule. Now, one of the steps that we can also do is we can add we can run a playbook. Later in this session, we will look into what playbooks are, but they are a more fancy way of not only changing the incident or alert itself, because that is when we think about those automation rules, they will only make changes to the incident or alert itself. But if we also want things to happen outside of the incident of alert, for example, we may want to go into Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and isolate a device from the network. That's when we need a playbook. So we can also trigger a playbook to run. The next step is that we can then start running rule expirations. So at this point, we can see that there is an indefinite endpoint, which means this rule will be running forever until we stop it. Or in some cases, for example, when we expect certain events to happen in our environment, we can also go and say, hey, you know what? I want this rule to be stopping to work at a certain date and time. And finally, there's also an order in which these automation rules are applied. If there is more rules that are responding to the same if this, then the order of the rules are important, because then what you'll notice is that the first rule will run first, and when this first rule is finished, then the next rule will run. So we have an order in which we apply the rules, And within an automation rule, we have an order in which those actions are going to be applied. And the first action will finish, and then after the first action finishes, the second action is going to be started. Just like that, we can start creating an automation rule like this. We can see the information. If you're done with the rule, you can edit it, you can disable it, you can move it up or down in the list if necessary. You can duplicate it to easily start with a next rule creation if you want to. Just like that, we have the way, this is for us a way to create automation rules. Now, as you can imagine, creating a rule from scratch requires you to do quite a bit of things when it comes to setting up the if-this section of the rule. So it might be more interesting to start, for example, from another component. For example, if you check out an analytics rule that you have created, for example, what if we find a malicious inbox rule in our environment, then what we can do if we check out this analytic rule, then what we can do is we can dive into the analytic rule wizard, and from here we can also go to the automated response section. Here we can see that we do have the existing rule here, but from here we can also choose to add a new rule. And what you'll notice is that it will then go in and say, well, you cannot change the conditions here anymore. So for example, here I could go and say, okay, let's name this my second automation rule. And you can see that I can no longer change the conditions. I can still change the action. So maybe in this example, I also want to assign a certain responsible person for this. Again, there is an end time and an order. So I just create that second automation rule. But if I would try to edit the automation rule here, we can see that it still says that it's the current rule that is responsible for creating that incident that is going to run the automation rule. If we now go back to the automation list, you will see that that new rule that we just created is not just being shown in this list, because now the analytic or the automation rule is bound to the analytic rule that we just used to start it. Just like that, it might in some cases also be a little bit difficult to see where a certain activity has come from, because in the set of automation rules, it's not that you just get to see that automation rule here. There's also a third way that you can use to create your own automation rules within Sentinel. What you can do is you can go into a certain incident. Now, I do not have an incident in this Sentinel workspace, so let's switch to another Sentinel workspace that has a couple of incidents. So for example, here I can go in and say, you know what, I have, for example, I have an incident here where we can see a certain person to have tried to access an unsanctioned cloud application. Now, you could question if this incident is actually meaningful to the Security Operations Center and the SOC analysts. Because if something was blocked, then apparently my solution to block access to a web application is successful. And do we really need to know when an action or when a solution has been doing its job successfully, right? The only thing that we might be interested in is when it is not successful. So maybe based on this incident, we might want to go and, well, respond to this in a more automated way. For example, we may just want to go and say, hey, let's just change the status to closed as soon as the incident is created. This automation task will save me a lot of work when I have to that I would otherwise have to do when I would manually have to close those incidents over and over again. So one of the things we can do here is we can start to automate the response to the incident. Now, if we check out the from here, for example, we could go directly into the analytics rule that created the incident, and from there we can still create the automation rule. Or if we go to action here, we can also choose to create an automation rule based on that incident. So here we go. If we click that create automation rule, then we can see that, and this is actually quite nice, the automation rule named is already being populated. The trigger is being configured. You can still that in this case, I do still have the I still do have the capability of changing my condition, because what you'll see when we create an automation rule like this, the automation rule is very specific in when it needs to be triggered. So for example, as you can see here in what it will show is that any incident provider where we choose the analytic rule name that we just selected, this is where the incident is based upon. And then we can see it's going to be very precise in what situation do we want to, well, get rid of this incident. So does it really only apply to this specific person? Or is it so that we want to just, we want to close the incident no matter what user is trying to access a certain website that is being blocked in the end? Or does it really only go about that one machine? Or do we want to close the incident no matter what machine a certain web application has been tried to be accessed and where it not succeeded? So you may want to go and say, let's just remove certain rows here to be more granular, to be more generic in what kind of incidents to automatically close. So like this, we can choose, for example, certain host names, or we can also get rid of that. You can also see this little icon here on the right, which is a plus and a couple of blocks that we can see as building blocks. And then you can see that we can even go into more and more and more. So for example, if I have a certain other device that I would also want to take into account, we can also use that. And just like that, we can make our solution way more specific. Now here, I am going to go and say, you know what, let's just block all of these, right? I don't want to be having a new incident whenever kind of, well, successful block has been shown. So here we are. So my condition is now a little bit more generic. Then my action is going to say that I'm going to change my status to closed. And we can see that this would be a benign positive, which is filled in by the automation rule itself, just like this. So what we see is I can go and say, hey, this is a positive. It's suspicious but expected, right? Yes, that makes sense. Or maybe it is a true positive. It may be actual suspicious activity. However, it's not really bad that it happened, right? So that is what we call a benign positive. We can add an other comment into this if we want to. You may want to also add extra actions to it. And you can see that there's also a default rule expiration. And this is a value that we can then just go and remove if we want to. But as you can see, we are not allowed to just do just everything. By removing the date and by removing the time, you will see that the automation rule is automatically going to run for the rest of its existence until we manually make changes to it. So just like that, we're going to click apply. This will create the new rule. So from here, we can see that we now created the automation rule just like that. This, by the way, does not immediately start taking action on the existing incidents. And the reason for that is that the trigger of the incident always was set to when a new incident is created. So what I want to do is the incidents that are currently still here, I want to close them manually, because then in that case, those are going to be gone from my environment. So if I go in and refresh now, you can see that my 2 incidents are gone. But now the next time an incident like this is being created, then that incident is automatically going to be closed. It doesn't mean that they are all gone, because you can always choose to go in and say, hey, show me all closed incidents, and you can still see them, and every new incidents that are being closed automatically by the automation rule will still be shown. So you can still dive into the history of your incidents. They will still appear in workbooks as well, but you will at least have the steps that you would otherwise have to manually take. We now automated these to make sure that we can have everything, well, that we can make sure that we do not have to work with all that many manual steps. So in this demonstration, we have been creating and managing automation rules in Microsoft Sentinel.